Greetings. So one thing's for sure, if you're running a webinar or a video conference, things are not going to go exactly according to plan. And it is nice to know that you're not alone. It generally happens to all of us. I was quite fascinated by all the things that can go wrong, so I reached out to the remote speaking community, which includes virtual presenters and trainers. And I'm very gratified by all the feedback and information I got. A lot of it that I hadn't even thought of myself, but in particular, I just want to mention two people who helped me a lot to put together the content for this, and that was Jackie Barry and Abigail Barnes. So thank you very much, and to everybody else whom I haven't mentioned individually. So there were two interesting main points that came out. The first one was we tend to spend so much time agonizing about the tech, when in actual fact, most of video conferencing and webinars is about the audience. So we need to perhaps focus a little bit more on connecting and being personable than getting all hung up about the hundreds and thousands of dollars that we're spending on our tech. The other thing that's most important is that most of the things that tend to go wrong in a video conference or a speech or a webinar is something that we could have sorted out if we'd planned properly up front. Now, I've already done a short video on orientation for participants, so what I'm going to focus on here is what the host can do to make sure that their video conference is a roaring success. There are 5 subcategories. The first one would be the role of the co-host. The second one would be how you plan your invitation. The third one would be how you plan your session. The fourth one being the introduction at the start of the session. And then finally, just a few things on settings, which in itself is a huge topic, but I'm just going to mention what I think are possibly the most important ones. So let's get cracking. The role of the co-host. I think you want to establish, depending on what kind of conference it is the co-host the speaker? Are they a co-trainer? Is it simply someone who's assisting you? And if so, they need to clearly understand what their role is, what the time frames are, how the session will be handled. So those things are critically important. And generally that the format has been discussed with them so that they know exactly what is going on. Even to the extent of what time you want them to be there so that there's no last minute pressure. Okay, then down to planning your invitation. Again, depending on what kind of event it is, it might be marketing material, it might just be an email invitation, but it needs to contain the URL, the password, and the login. And it also needs to have clarity on the time zone, particularly if you have a geographical mix of participants. If there's a large proportion of them in an area, in a specific area outside of yours, then you might specify for that time zone, it's this particular time on their calendars. So your information should be simple and practical, but there should be enough of it to be appealing and to make them want to attend your event. And what I like to do is to provide an orientation video or something written out just so the participants know what's expected of them and generally the way that you like to run your video conference. So that's planning your invitation. Then the planning of your session, which is probably the most important part of it. The first thing that you want to do is to brief your speaker, your trainer, about the flow of the event. You also would like to be aware of roughly how many people will be attending, because if it's a very large event, then you need to plan a webinar. If it's a smaller event or a classroom training type situation, then you'll be looking at a video conference where you can have a bit more interaction with your delegates. And then there are things pertaining to, do you want the video to be on or off, and so on, but we'll get to that during settings. So you then want to be looking at your time frames, and the time frames are quite important because different hosts run their webinars in different ways. What I can say to you is that participants are generally getting very annoyed with having to wait for a long time before the action starts, and a long time is anything longer than 10 minutes. But I like to get my session going, in other words, from a content point of view, within 4 minutes of the start time. So generally I allow up to 90 seconds for late comers to enter the session, and then I get going with the introduction, so that if I have to introduce myself, we're looking at about 60 seconds. If I have to introduce the speaker, a maximum of 90 seconds. Within 4.5 minutes, we're actually into the content, and the interview, the speech, whatever it is, has actually begun. So those time frames are pretty important. But before we get there, there's obviously the time for entering the meeting. I like in the orientation to let them know that I will let people in 5 minutes before, but my co-host, I like them there a little bit earlier, because then we can mutually do a sound check and a video check and so on and so forth. So your time frames are very important. There needs to be clarity on what time the session will kick off, and you need to develop a reputation that you're somebody that gets going at the time that you say that you're going to get going. Delegates also want to know, or participants want to know, things like planned breaks, when are they going to be, and roughly how long the session is going to be, and that's pretty important. What I also like to do is that I'm notorious for forgetting to record an important session, so I set an alarm 1 minute after the start time of the session. I know I wouldn't have started by then, and it just alerts me to get the recording up and going so that I don't lose what could be a fantastic session. So the fourth area is the introduction at the start. You want to welcome your participants warmly. If it's a smaller group, you can in fact introduce them and welcome them individually as you let them in from the waiting room. Remember, with the waiting room, you can let in batches of people or people one at a time, and you can select who you're going to be letting in. If the session is being recorded, don't forget to welcome the people that will be watching the recording, because it's nice to know that you weren't forgotten, and that because you weren't part of the session, you're not important. It's just a nice little touch. And if the host is also the speaker or the trainer, then you want to introduce yourself briefly. I set up to 60 seconds. I wouldn't even go as long as that. I would say 30 seconds is quite long enough. And then give your speaker or your trainer a slightly longer introduction. And of course, it's important then to introduce the topic. Then you want to let them know how the questions are going to be handled, so people can unmute themselves in a video conference in order to ask a question. But generally, an accepted format is to type your question in the chat box, and if the host is running the session properly, they will then read out the questions from the chat box, not everything from the chat box, because then it gets a little bit tedious, because actually people can read. Then the fifth and the last part is the settings, and the few that I just want to focus on, and this in itself you could make a whole video of, but the ones I want to focus on is right at the bottom. You get the reactions, where people can raise their hand, they can clap, or they can give a thumbs up. So enable the reaction so that people can give some kind of approval to the speaker or the trainer. Try and disable the save chat, so that in case there is sensitive information, people can't then record that and misuse it at a later stage. What I prefer to do is to ask people to mute their microphones, but you can do that yourself when they're in the waiting room. So you can mute them upon entry, but it is nice to see their faces, so ask them to put their video on so that you can see them when they come in. And then at a later stage, if they want to turn those off, well, they've got the option to do that. So that sums up the 5 points. I'll just go through them again very quickly. Firstly, it's the role of the co-host, the planning of your invitation, the planning of your session, the introduction at the start, and some of the basic settings. And if you can focus on planning properly for those 5 areas, you will generally find that your video conference or webinar will go pretty much according to the way that you planned it. Au revoir.